Center for New American Security. I'd like to introduce our two other panelists here. You've already heard from our first two. In addition to that, we have Dr. John Hawley. He's an engineering psychologist with the U.S. Army's Research Laboratory at Fort Bliss. And we also have Dr. Caitlin Surakitbanharn. She's a research scientist with Purdue University's Policy Research Institute. We heard a lot at the top here about the trust issues and about potential problems. And while there's a lot of exciting possibilities within this space, those are certainly concerns that are going to come up. Dr. Hawley, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on what you heard so far.
Trust in automation is an interesting issue. I've spent a lot of my career early and then with a gap going off to do some other interesting things for the Army, like the ill-fated Future Combat Systems, and then came back to Patriot after the fratricides during OIF to lead a human factors-oriented evaluation at the direction of the CG down there to find out, well, we understand how this happened from a technical perspective, from an engineering perspective. Now, how did human factors contribute to this incident? The Army had started out, when they first began using the Patriot system in fully automatic mode, with the mandate to the crews that they were to trust the system without question. In other words, they took the issue of trust and automation off the table, which probably was all right at that time because they didn't train those people well enough to be able to understand how the system did what it did. After OIF, I've seen a shift in the other direction where crews now mostly distrust the automation, rightfully or wrongly, and as a result of that, they try to impose themselves more into the loop, the decision-making loop, the command and control loop, as opposed to using the system more appropriately in an on-the-loop or a supervisory control mode. So in some sense, they learned some of the wrong lessons out of OIF, which is not to trust the system because it won't make the right decisions, and if it doesn't, bad things will happen and we'll get into trouble.
Caitlin?
So I was really excited to hear Jeff say that we're going to live in a society where our automation fails. People don't talk about that enough. So I do human function allocation, which means basically what are we going to have humans do in all of these automated systems. And we've been talking about the race for AI, the race for automated systems. And I think as a country and as a group of researchers, we need to focus on not being first to have this technology, but the first ones to get it right. And I think figuring out what humans are going to do in these systems is how we're going to get it right, and it's going to be how we set ourselves apart as a nation. Systems will fail. They will. They're computer programs. They will fail. They will pick the wrong image. There will be bugs in the programs, and when they do fail, how are we going to take over? How are humans going to take over these highly complex automated systems? And there's a huge range of types of systems that we can talk about. We can talk about like fighter jets, where it's definitely too complex for a human to take over, so if it fails, you eject. And then you can talk about driving, where we all can drive. And if we have an automated system and that fails, at what point can we take over? At what level of that kind of automation are we capable of taking over? And what function do we have to be doing while the automation's running for us to be able to safely take over when the automation fails?
Okay. Question really for any of you, particularly when we look at this through a national security perspective. We look at this as through the perspective of how this might be injected into our military. There will be certainly concern. Troops, as they are attempting to use this, some of them are going to be excited about it. Some of them are not going to want to touch it. What would you say to them as you're, I guess, pitching these sorts of potential solutions and also dealing with the pitfalls and the risks and all of that? That's open to any of you.
That's become an interest of mine, is how you properly prepare an organization to use this kind of technology. I think that one of the lessons that I observed in Patriot, and I'm not condemning the Army, it's just that the Army got there first. Patriot has been, the engagement process could be fully autonomous, and it has been for more than 30 years. But when you put that type of technology into an organization that has ideas about how such systems are to be used, that can create problems. You have got to, in a sense, transform that organization to deal with that technology. And I find that in the military, and again, my experiences have only been with the Army, that is very difficult to do. You've got to go out and you've got to change a lot of there are a lot of legal, regulatory, and just cultural practice constraints that get in the way of doing that. You also have to re-educate commanders at various levels for how this stuff is to be used. I've been doing a lot of work in network-enabled mission command over the last couple of years, and it shows up even there where there isn't a lot of control automation, but there's a lot of information automation. And the stuff doesn't show particularly well in a lot of operational tests, even to the point where systems that, like WinT, that perhaps aren't the best, but get a bad reputation simply because these units don't know how to use this stuff. They don't know how to use it. They don't know how to maintain it properly. So there is a transformation process that has to go on. There are lots of new skills, particularly in the area of how you command an organization that has this technology, that I think we've only begun to scratch the surface on. It changes what they do and how they do it.
Any other thoughts along those lines?
I would just say that in my experience, humans are pretty good at figuring out how well things work. And so if they can use a system a lot and realize that it's working quite well, then they begin to trust it. In the case that you gave, it's rather remarkable. Somebody decided to ignore 7 warnings and trust the car enough to drive down the road. And potentially there's rumors that the person might have been watching a movie, et cetera. We don't know this for sure. But the point is that somebody experimented enough with that system. I'm sure the first time they engaged it, they were sitting there like that. And then over time, they basically could come to say, this is working. And so I actually think that these technologies will sell themselves if they're reliable enough that the more that you use them, eventually you just start saying, okay, this is either better than me or it's good enough and I'm gonna use it. So the real thing is maybe convincing people to use systems that you don't actually get to experiment with a lot. That might be a different sort of human factor issue. But for the stuff that you get to do, like self-driving, talking to your phone and having it transcribe into text and whatnot, the better they get, eventually people will just switch over if they're better than themselves or the humans.
I do think it's worth, though, to think about that high reliability factor. And I think that also injects a level of complacency among people. And when that does happen, like the driver of Tesla, so they were the first ones to have autopilot, and they were also the first ones to kill somebody because they were complacent. The driver became complacent. It worked however many times, and then it didn't work. And I think that level of complacency can be very dangerous, especially in a national security sense, where you trust that, even doing like image recognition, so you trust that the computer has caught this every single time. So you stop paying attention, and then the time that it misses it, the time that it throws you a warning that something seems off, and you disregard it, and it could be absolutely catastrophic from an infrastructure perspective, from a security perspective, or from a lives lost perspective. And I think that level of complacency, and how do we address that? I think that's, we don't know how to address that yet, but I think that's something that's really, really key in this discussion.
I think it's also really important to make sure that part of the training or the organizational familiarity with this technology involves an understanding of the capabilities of the system. So as an example, I have a friend who just moved to Boston from Florida last year. Spent his whole life in Florida, been alive for 30 years, so he's been driving for 15 years, and he's an excellent driver. First time it snowed in Boston last year was a challenge. So that's an example where it's pretty obvious from a human standpoint, something is different here. But if you don't know all of the factors that go into the capabilities, it may not be as obvious when something has changed that requires additional capability.
One additional spin on that I think one of the gentlemen that was sitting in this chair in the previous panel brought up is that when you get into some of these situations like you're describing, expecting an operator to recognize that something has gone amiss with the system and intervene appropriately is probably an unrealistic expectation. And in that case, you're probably, my guess would be, I have some data on this, but not a lot, that again, in the case of air and missile defense, perhaps a lot of aspects of tactical control of those types of systems are best left to automated systems, with the human's position in the command and control complex being relegated to a more high-level or strategic position, setting the parameters within which the system operates. The mistakes will still be made, but at least those mistakes will be repeatable. You can understand why it was made after the fact. When you're dealing with humans who will then intervene in that process, perhaps inappropriately, you'll never understand why it happened that way.
Okay. Thinking through some of this from the opposite side, Caitlin, you mentioned that we may not want to be first here. We want to make sure we get it right. I imagine looking at this, especially when you look back through history at things like Sputnik, where we were not first, there's a freak out, from the U.S. side over, okay, now we need to catch up. And culturally, both with our senior leaders and also rank and file service members who again would be dealing with this. What do you think should be said should something like that arise?
Should we not be first? I think that, and this is hard because this comes from our American culture of American exceptionalism, that we should be first and we should be best. But I think actually we should focus on being best more than first. I think, and we've seen this with some technologies, and I think we'll see it potentially with autonomous vehicles. The people that are first will fail, and I think they'll fail in a very big way, unfortunately. And I think the people that come around in maybe the third or fourth round of these types of technologies will be the ones that get it right. And you don't want to be the company that fails, or we don't want to be the country that fails, or we don't want to be the country that unethically kills millions of people because we haven't figured out all of the bugs of our technology. I think from an optics perspective, we'd much rather be not on that end of policy making or of the news cycle. And I think that's a pretty strong argument. You don't want to be responsible for the robot drone that's outrageously killing large numbers of people because we haven't figured out what's making it make the wrong decision.
I just want to maybe point out that we should potentially differentiate between being first at deployment versus being first at research. So I fully agree that we may not have any need to be the first to deploy a system, but we absolutely want to be out in front, way out in front if possible, on the research side or the knowledge side. So anything that we're not confident in, we better at least have that on testing sites. Because as somebody mentioned earlier today, this is kind of like Hogwarts. There's new magical, mind-blowing results coming out by the week and by the month. If you've ever heard of the term technological surprise, AI is going to deliver it in spades because the technology is amazingly powerful, it's advancing at a rapid clip, and we cannot predict what capabilities it might have in just a few years, let alone sometimes months. And so we absolutely do not want to be so safe and so secure that we are not right at the cutting edge in terms of knowing exactly what's going on, because we don't want to be caught by surprise and trying to play catch-up in a game in which sudden AI capabilities, we heard from the previous Draper program officer, might allow you to seize the power grid of Manhattan, for example, or to take control of every robot or car in an entire country in a heartbeat. So perhaps first in deployment is not necessary, but definitely first in research. I think we absolutely should be all in on investing and researching AI, military and companies.
Totally agree.
When we look at where our autonomous systems are now, things we've seen, the Strategic Capabilities Office and some of the work they've done, Purdue, some of those smaller things that have surfaced. What do you think's missing from this conversation of trust, of being first, of being right, all those sorts of things?
What do we think is missing? A term that I use a lot when I'm discussing these things with higher ranking officers, and particularly with the Department of Defense's acquisition people, is that when this technology enters military organizations, it becomes part of a complex socio-technical system. And most of the time, the emphasis, I would say 90% or even higher of the emphasis during development of this is purely on the technical side of the hardware. Very little consideration of how the humans relate to that, very little consideration of what proper training for the use of such systems, education and training for the use of such technologies has to look like, and how you have to change the organization to make better use of this technology. Almost no consideration of that. What the military calls all the .LP, doctrine, organization, training, leader development, and personnel considerations are given almost hand-waving associated with it. I mean, that's been one of my major gripes for years and years and years. You go back and look at it and say, these are complex socio-technical systems. You can't treat them as if we are evaluating simply hardware solutions. When you put people into them, they become something else. DoD has to learn that lesson.
So to build on that, I agree that so much of the technology is the focus, the programming, the types of technologies we're designing, but there's not a lot of talk of what are the humans going to do. Supervisory control, works in some cases, but it has been proven to not be effective for quite a few cases. So what are they going to do in turn? We don't know, and not very many people are talking about it, and I think it's a big component of how we're going to actually be able to implement this kind of technology.
And to build on that, I think it's really important to think about how people will interact with the systems. So as a user interface designer, I've walked into a lot of projects where someone says, well, it just needs to work, just put a user interface on it. And by then, it's much too late. These are issues you need to solve early on in the design process so that you have the right, ICDs for the technical folks or the right hooks into the system to get information to a user at the right level. So these are issues we should start thinking about now.
Thinking this through again from the humans and machines perspective here, we've reached a point where the military is not always driving development, not always driving innovation, and there, I imagine, will be skepticism or suspicion at times that industry is too far in front and pitching its ideas, and especially from the end user point of view, that maybe these things aren't ready. Sort of from the psychology side of things, from the leadership side of things, how do you, I guess, suss that out?
Why has DoD lagged? I can give you my impressions as to why that is. It has to do with the defense acquisition process and all the regulations that go with that. It isn't what the guy from Google said earlier with that name Schmidt. He said is that yes, they don't lead anymore. They probably, my observation is, they don't hire the kinds of people that the Googles and Apples and Microsofts of the world can hire or do hire. It hasn't tended to be an exciting place to work. Requirements are written without really understanding very well what you're asking for. Defense contractors go out and they're really almost punished or not rewarded for being innovative. It's much, much safer in the defense acquisition arena to take a less innovative approach and then work on it. As I sometimes have observed somewhat laughingly, is that inefficiency in defense acquisition is profitable. And so they're not, risk-taking is punished both on the side for contractors, it's hazardous. It's hazardous for program offices who get graded primarily in the interest of time and budget. And so they'll take the safe way out and build systems that don't advance the state of the art very much, which then again, that wraps around and back on itself, and it says you don't get the best and the brightest who want to work on the systems for the Northrop Grummans and those people of the world, because that's not where the action is. It's with Google and it's with Microsoft and companies that do that kind of work.
I think it's cultural risk perception. I think out in Silicon Valley, the companies, the people that own it, the managers, people that are hiring, they're willing to take risks on innovators. People are willing to accept innovation. They're willing to try new things. They're excited by it. And I think the culture, particularly within military, is definitely to minimize risk. And to take some of these new technologies, like AI or autonomous systems, definitely requires a risk-seeking culture. And I think until we change that kind of risk perception culture, you're going to have a hard time. And there's definitely also underlying politics, of course, that go with that kind of stuff. But I think risk perception and kind of the culture that space lives in plays a big role in how we accept and how quickly we accept new technologies like that.
This isn't new either. If you go back and you look at the history of aviation, some of the people like Billy Mitchell and others who advocated changes in concepts and changes in practice and building different kinds of systems actually got into serious trouble. They were not rewarded for that. And then you can take a look at the development of interesting concepts using technology during the interwar period. For example, the development of Blitzkrieg doctrine, which all of that stuff was there and everybody had it. The Germans just developed it more fully because they were willing to take risks, be experimental, and they had lost the last war. And they did a deep inquiry into why they had done that, which the British and the French didn't, and of course we weren't even in the game at that time. So yes, it's partly cultural, and I don't know how you bridge that cultural gap. The military has a tendency to be innately conservative, and it's going to be a tough nut to crack.
So a good example of this is with air traffic control. It's unbelievably difficult to get new technologies put into play in American air traffic control. The FAA has an extremely lengthy process to do that. But if you go to other countries where they have, what do you call it, that they're privatized, I'm sorry, they have privatized air traffic control, they are light years ahead of us. I've been in these facilities in other countries. They are light years ahead of us as far as technology and capability because they're not constrained by this very risk-averse culture of the government. And I think that plays a big role.
If you take risks in a defense acquisition project and you bring a system, usually in order to sell it, you have to make very optimistic assumptions about its performance and its costs and its timelines and things like that. And eventually they will, and I'm working with a system now where they have done just that, and they brought it out for test well before its time. This one was given a reprieve of 4 years, but the usual case is to say, oh, this system is no good. Therefore, we cut your budget and possibly even cancel it. And so the people who manage the systems are well aware of this. And that has a tendency to make them risk averse and also to make them less than forthcoming during operational tests about what these system capabilities really are. It's a perverse environment of their own creation. It's easy to understand it from the outside, but it's very, very difficult if you're on the inside to change it. It's just almost unchangeable. I don't know what it would take.
I imagine it probably is a matter of time, just based on the nature of acquisition, the nature of development, and the dangerous missions that sometimes intertwine with this space. Something bad will happen that will be on the page 1 of the Washington Post and every other newspaper in the country that covers this. There will be a tendency on Capitol Hill, there will be a tendency in the media to scrutinize all of that, and it will be necessary. But at the same time, there will be a likelihood to probably recoil afterwards. How do you I guess push and press to continue the development when you're going to face a lot of pressure at that point?
That's a hard question to answer too, because again, in the case of Patriot, you can see it. After the second fratricide in OIF, the Air Force, which has operational control of Army big missile air defense, shut it down. And they could only shoot at targets or tracks that had been specifically authorized by the Air Force Ops Center that they could shoot. That effectively took Patriot out of the system, or out of the war at that point in time. Luckily, they didn't have anything left to shoot at, or nothing happened. But that is an example of the kinds of pushback reaction you're likely to get. And if more damage had been done, I can definitely see that the people in this building right over there might get in the act and pass a bunch of laws that would seriously get in the way of advancing this technology, rather than realizing that, yes, it makes mistakes. And it's got to be expected. I mean, we didn't develop commercial aviation or even military aviation to the state it is right now without having to experience a lot of crashes. A lot of planes crashed. And in this current environment, I sometimes wonder whether, as risk averse as we have become in these areas, if we had been that risk averse back then, where we would be with respect to even that simpler technology. To develop it takes a lot of risk, and it's not always going to work properly. A lot of people will die.
I agree.
I'd like each of you to present an idea, just a minute or two, of something that excites you in this space that doesn't always get attention. Any idea that comes to mind?
I'll start the ball rolling. I got to take an excursion after working with the air and missile defense people for a while. I think they had enough of me and I had enough of them. And so I went off to work with the maneuver force, infantry and armor types, looking at network-enabled mission command. And I started thinking about command and control for these types of highly automated systems in a very different way after I had that experience, a newer experience with the maneuver forces. They have this concept of mission command, which is basically mission orders sort of adapted or copied from the Germans and applied in our own way. And I think that sort of philosophy applies if you're dealing with increasingly intelligent systems somewhere in your network. That the idea that you're going to have in-the-loop control over those kinds of systems operating in very complex environments, doing very complex things in very short time periods is probably being unrealistic. we'll have to get to the point where our view of these things in terms of what humans in the loop really means, or human oversight, it's more of that strategic, is I'm going to allow you to operate almost like a subordinate military unit would operate. I realize you'll not always do things properly. I'm going to set the parameters within which you operate. But I think we need to understand better how you properly prepare people at various levels in these command echelons to operate that way. It takes a change in the philosophy, or a change in their orientation toward what it means to command an organization that has a lot of this technology in it, operating within the intent of the commander, even if sometimes that operating is being done by an artificial entity.
Any other thoughts?
I would like to see where the tipping point is of where humans have the ability to perform takeover in an automated system, and at what level of automation do we lose that ability. So looking at systems from you're in a positive state where nothing is happening or the system's operating appropriately, and then you have a non-positive state where it's failing. And what are the functions of such a system that would move you to that non-optimal state? And if we were to manipulate them and automate these different functions, at what level do humans lose the ability to have safe takeover? That's what really excites me about the automated field right now.
I'm really interested in understanding how autonomous systems and people can learn and train together. So we talked a lot earlier about how a lot of machine learning systems get trained and then get sent out into the field, and that's their end state. There are a lot of people looking at how you can have systems keep learning, and I think there could be some really powerful ways to build trust in systems and build appropriate trust in systems if you can train with your robot like you would another teammate, and sort of structure the learning in both directions.
So I want to think a little bit on the longer term view. We spent a lot of time today talking about how humans should be in the loop, and that AI should be explainable to humans. But both of those goals basically assume that humans are better than AI. And we've had a little bit of pushback on that idea, but in the near term, that's certainly going to be true. But in the long term, I just want to entertain the possibility that it might be hubristic to think that we're smarter and better than what AI will soon be, because the rate of AI is progressing extremely rapidly, and we have no idea where AI is going to take us in the near future. So Ilya Sutskever, who's one of the founders of OpenAI, where Jack works, mentioned to me the other day something that I think is actually a possibility that we need to consider, which is that AI may gain very powerful capabilities. We don't know whether or not that's a few years or decades, but it's likely to happen. And we need to think about a world in which that happens. Maybe our puny human brains aren't ready to understand the explanation for why a decision was made, because we are limited in our cognitive capacities in a way that AI may not be. And we may have to get used to a world in which a lot of decisions are made for us that we can't figure out or understand, and which we're not better when we're in the loop. And I know that I pointed out a lot of limitations on AI, but I also simultaneously am a big believer, if you look at the curves of advance, that this might take off and be rather interesting and maybe possess superhuman capabilities in the near future. And we want to think about that. And Ilya talks about the fact that, he thinks there's a probability of 100% that eventually some rogue agent, whether or not it's a lone wolf or a foreign government, will try to create AI that self-replicates and tries to take control of the world and maybe gets beyond the control of that lone agent or government. And we need to be able to potentially combat that. I know this is the movie and the nightmare scenario that a lot of people like to dismiss, but I'm actually with Ilya and Elon Musk that this is a concern, even if it's only a 1% concern or less, that we need to think about, because there are serious consequences if that happens. So Ilya calls that a cancer, and he is working on an AI immune system, which is a system by governments, by companies, and by nonprofits such as OpenAI, that are trying to look and detect when cancer emerges, when might some very, very powerful AI advance be out there, and detect it, and then maybe try to contain it. Now, of course, that's AI fighting AI. What could possibly go wrong? But I just want to say that I don't think this is beyond the realm of science fiction, or only in the realm of science fiction. That, it's myopic to think that it's going to be a steady linear increase. It's probably going to be exponential increase in capability, and there's a lot of people in this room who probably should think about a world in which foreign governments or our own have tremendously powerful AI that we can't fully control or understand.
I'd like to open it to questions. There should be microphones going around. Okay. I'd ask that your question ends with a question mark, and that you just wait for the microphones.
This is Tim Marler from RAND Corporation. When you're talking about neural networks, and perhaps this applies to AI in general, but fundamentally it's a model, and you find some parameters to kind of fit that hypersurface of sorts to a set of training data. And if it's overfit or underfit, you have error. And that causes some problems, as we've been talking about. But there seems to be precedence for this. Let's say finite element analysis or structural engineering code, which might have error when it predicts when a crash or a set of loads crushes a car. And you can go back as far to where you have a curve fit to 3 points. There's some error. But we've developed trust for those things, perhaps through V&V, through validation. But now we're having this discussion today about another model. Is there some precedence for this? And why is this special? Are there lessons learned? Not to suggest this is as simple as a curve fit through points, but if you look back, how is this different from other very complicated models? And are there some lessons learned for instilling trust or developing trust?
Any thoughts?
In some sense, it's the same, and in some sense, it's a little bit different. I think it's the level of complexity and the capabilities of the system. So these problems have always been there. They're not new. But when you look at a curve, you can kind of envision very easily in a human intuitive way how it might go wrong, what the other curves might be. But if a deep neural net can drive your car and 100,000 miles, it has no accident, you start to trust it, and then all of a sudden you have a fatal crash. Because you are lulled into a sense of complacency. So it's just that these systems are bigger, they're more complex, they're more capable, and they're more opaque, so maybe it just highlights all of the old issues and brings them into new relief.
Another question? I see microphone right there.
Micah Clark, Office of Naval Research. Two questions. One, as it relates to appropriate trust and reliance, does the desire for that and hopefully the desire for it to be honest and informative shape what kind of methods are appropriate? So, for example, in a self-driving car that's based on a deep network, providing an explanation for its decision-making to a human operator user that was objectively true would not be very informative, not even to the most expert out there, because the math isn't that complicated, it's about the training history. Second, most of the conversation so far has been about trust and reliance with respect to humans' assessment of the machine. But if we're really moving towards a teaming kind of model, have you thought at all about when you want the machine, if at all, to usurp the human in terms of the authority to act? I think of cases like the German air wings, where you have an autopilot set to crash that knew it was going to crash, but was never designed or intended to cede authority from a human operator. And we have lots of cases like that. It's hard to imagine wanting the system to cede authority when it can't assess whether it's still within its own acceptable performance envelope or not. But if we move away from sheer mistakes and we move to bad actors in the human sphere, which there always will be, Ron Arkin and others have made that argument on the morality side, do we want to think about when is it appropriate for machines to act to block human actions when we perceive them to be malevolent, which is not the same case as humans being too stupid to compete with these super intelligent beings that we're somehow going to magically create?
Yeah, so I think there are already cases where you want machines to make decisions instead of humans. The example earlier of the aborted takeoff was a good example. There are just limits of whether it's reaction time or perception that humans can do better than robots, and we've reliably demonstrated that this is true. I think that as we approach a scenario where you have humans and machines teaming more or less as equals or with defined roles, we figured out what humans are good at, what machines are good at, that will have to be investigated absolutely on a case-by-case basis. You'll get things where it's no longer reaction time, but it's some other cognitive element that we've demonstrated that a machine is more reliable. So it's absolutely true.
I think psychologically and socially, we would also have a little bit of pushback to jump over that hump. I think people innately feel uncomfortable interacting with a system that they can't stop it and say, no, don't do that, regardless of whether they're right or wrong. We like to have control. So I think we would definitely have to figure out how to frame such a movement forward. where we are trusting the system to be making the correct choice and the safe choice. It would definitely be a trust issue. Whether we know it or not, the general public, we always assume rational operators, but we don't have a system of rational operators. So we have to kind of jump over that hump, and I think that'll be quite challenging.
I've already seen something like that where when the Army's been transitioning from the current command and control apparatus for Patriot to integrated battle command under the IAMD concept. IAMD is a far more highly automated system, and they're going to have to come to grips with how to use that system, which they haven't really done. They've worked the technical side of it. The test operators, who generally come from the Patriot community, tend to look at that system through the lens of Patriot. And one of the comments they make is, we would like it to work more like Patriot. One of the things that bugs them is that when they allow the system to engage a track, the system doesn't necessarily do it right away. It will schedule it, and it tells them that it schedules it for engagement, which means using the logic, my internal logic, me speaking of that system, I will schedule that track for engagement at the appropriate time, and if I still think it needs to be engaged. And that absolutely drives these old-style Patriot test operators up the wall. They hate it, and they constantly complain about it. When I push that button, I want it to shoot that track. Not schedule it, I want it to shoot it. It's that issue of being in control. Now, what will happen with this system when it goes, will it be fielded with that capability? I don't know. It all depends on whether those troops accept it. In the Army and the Command and General Staff Colleges run surveys with students in there, and I just read the most recent one coming out of the Mission Command Battle Lab about the acceptance of some of these technologies by younger officers who are more amenable to using technology, more so than the older officers. A great deal of skepticism about allowing themselves to be overridden by technology or by machines countermanding what they might decide to do. So yes, you will probably get some real pushback in doing that. Cultural, yes. Maybe rational, maybe not rational. I don't know. Hard to say.
Yes, over here we have a couple.
Hi, I'm Ali Wan with the RAND Corporation. I wanted to follow up on a point or kind of a conjecture that Dr. Clune made. And so we've heard a lot today about the many ways in which artificial intelligence either is rivaling human capacity or in some cases exceeding human capacity. And I think that one of the reasons that human beings are inherently skeptical of at least certain aspects of artificial intelligence is a sense that we are ceding authority to a force that we can't completely understand. And so it raises the question, if we reach, hypothetically, we cross a threshold where artificial intelligence eclipses human beings, encroaches on areas of creativity that are normally the preserve of human beings, what gives human beings their unique identity? What are the core characteristics of being a human being if we reach a threshold at which artificial intelligence supplants us in one category after another?
I think that the history of humanity is a lesson in humility, right? We used to think that the world was created for us, around us, that we were the center of the universe, and it's been a series of body blows to our ego over time, right? And the terrain that we have strided over with confidence and reigned over is shrinking in terms of AI. If you look at the history of AI, there used to be this long list of things that AI can't do that we can do, and it's just kind of slowly shrinking, right? So the same exact system that I proposed earlier today, where I have a computer artist that's trying to make images that appease a deep neural network, which you could think of as a judge or a critic, that same system actually also produced a lot of beautiful images that looked like art to us. And most people consider art one of the last vestiges that's safe for AI to have dominance over AI, so for humans to have dominance over AI. So just on a lark, my students and I decided to submit those artworks to a competitive art competition held at my university, where student artists spend the entire year developing their artistic portfolio, submit it, and only a very few of them, something like 35% of them, are accepted and hung on the wall of the museum. Not only was our computer AI-generated art accepted, but it was also one of the pieces that was given an award. So there were people having wine and cheese sitting there trying to interpret the intention of the artist, not knowing, and the judges who accepted the piece of work also didn't know that it was completely AI-generated. There was no intent, at least not in the conventional sense. So it's a fabulous question, and we're just going to slowly have to continuously wrestle with the fact that we're not special, in my opinion, as AI gets more and more powerful.
Get another question over here.
Thank you all. This has been a really fascinating discussion. I'd be curious to hear whether you're starting to see or expect to see distinct differences in terms of how different cultures or nations are approaching these human factors issues. And secondly, I'd be curious as well to discuss some of the challenges of adopting current organizational constructs and concepts to AI. To what extent do you think it's necessary to start from scratch in a sense and start thinking about designing entirely new concepts and or organizational structures around AI, and can you imagine what that might look like going forward? Thank you.
I can take the first part. So I did a lot of research over in Asia, and I found that Asians tend to be really excited about the possibilities of autonomous systems and AI. And when you talk to them about how humans will interact with that or about trust, particularly in maybe slightly more developing nations, they are very anxious to be the front runners. So they don't have nearly as much caution to the wind, I think, that the developed nations have about this type of stuff. Whether that's good or bad, I don't really have an opinion on that. But they definitely are more accepting of new technologies, new ideas. They're really anxious to put themselves on the map. So we talked a lot about China before, and the Chinese are a lot more excited about doing this kind of stuff from a public perspective, not from a research perspective, from a public perspective. And I think culturally that's something very different. So they definitely don't have the risk-averse problems that we do in certain sectors of society. I think if you were to take kind of a cultural snapshot of a lot of these countries in Asia, they would be a lot more similar to Silicon Valley than they would be to our like government structure. They're definitely a lot more excited to get into it, and they're willing to tackle a lot of these human factors issues a lot more openly, I think. At least that's been the experience that I've had working over in Asia.
Does anybody want to take the other half of that question?
I think the answer to that is yes, but don't ask me what they'll look like. Paul Charest asked me one time in an email conversation about some of those kinds of things, or about the ways of relating to this type of automation technology in the sphere that I work. And I told him he ought to go talk to the Israelis because they appear to be doing a better job of that than we do. I can't really explain why that is. I think it has to do with more dynamic and better cooperation between their R&D side of the house and the military side of the house. They're not so separate. But he said it's difficult to get a handle on what they do because they won't talk about it. And I'd have to say that I found the same thing. I can generally get an idea of how, for example, Iron Dome works, but specifically how they structure their organizations or their command and control concepts for that, I really can't say. I can make some guesses about it based on my own experience, but I have no direct evidence of that because they tend not to want to talk about it.
We've got time for one more rapid-fire question, unless you
Can I
have...
just take one stab at the second half of that question? If I understood your question correctly, it was what might like organizational structures look like amongst interacting AI agents? And if that's the question, I think it's a fascinating one to consider because the types of cognition in AI will be very, very different from those in humans. So for example, right now AI is actually, almost every AI that you encounter and you read about is a one-trick pony. It can only solve one task, and if it learns something really well, like how to play Go, it can go learn another task, but then it's forgotten how to play Go. But if we can solve that problem, which is called the problem of catastrophic forgetting, and get AI that can learn many, many different tasks like we do, and then periodically go back and refine them, then you have to start wondering whether or not you need the sorts of hierarchical organization that you see in human civilization. For example, we have to have specialists that focus on, internal medicine or military organizational structure or, aeronautics and whatnot. But might an AI that can kind of keep all of that in mind be able to study all of those things simultaneously? And therefore, would you need hierarchies? Would you need division of labor and specialization? I think it's a fascinating question that few people are talking about.
One more question.
Yeah, I just want to bring up a kind of interesting project that my daughter is working on. She's a high school STEM student. And so the research she's been working on during the summer internship was kind of studied the brain-computer, brain-machine interface. And essentially, the initial intention is trying to implant something into human brain so that the patient can interact with artificial limbs or whatever. And then along that whole discussion, her professor actually talk about the possibility of integrate AI with human brain. So all the discussion we had so far is more about treating AI as a separate machine, separate entity. But I think in the near future, very likely there's going to be AI enhanced human being. And so the brain can interact with our AI directly, and that whole, it actually enhance the brain power of human being. And once you're at that level, I think that whole teaming concept, or maybe I don't know how to describe this, but I think it's going to open a very different scenario on how we leverage this capability to enhance human beings' life and maybe additional risk. I don't know. I mean, you're all researchers. I don't know if there's any research you guys are doing on this, or any concept you want to share with us. Just general question.
Any thoughts? And I think that's pretty much all the time we'll have.
I just agree that that's a promising area. There's going to be a lot of work and a lot of exciting developments on that front.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.